Ladies and gentlemen, hello and welcome to Compass here on gbcm.com. Today I have a very special guest from Australia, Mrs. Erina Flethcher. Erina, welcome to Compass. How are you?
I'm really good, thank you. And what about yourself?
Fine, thank you. Erina, thanks a lot for joining us here on my channel on Compass on a very, very interesting debate. And I'm so glad I found actually someone from the Faculty of Law from Canberra in Australia to talk to me about zombie laws. I mean, that sounds absolutely like science fiction, something out of a movie. But tell me, you're a lecturer at the Faculty of Law in Canberra. How did you come across this subject?
So the article that we're talking about, I actually wrote when I was an undergraduate. So I've sort of gone full circle in my career where I practiced as a lawyer for about 5.5, 6 years. And then I was invited back to do the occasional guest lecture at the university, which then progressed into a full-time academic career. So I've been really lucky in the sense that I got to write this as an undergraduate, and now I'm revisiting it as an academic. So that's sort of where we're here today.
Well, that was 2016.
That was 2016.
And how was your first contact? How did you come across this subject, if I may ask?
So this was I think it was my penultimate year of university, so my second last year. And I was rapidly running out of subjects that I could do that didn't involve tax law or something, advanced corporations law or something that, just did not appeal to me. And so we studied a unit called the Canberra Law Review, where we had to draft, prepare, and write our own articles on a specified topic. And our topic was zombies. And at that time, so in 2016, games like The Last of Us were absolutely kicking off. It was very popular. Shows like The Walking Dead and, every second movie was a zombie movie. So we were flooded with pop fiction with zombies. And then that's how this sort of was developed.
But reading your article, and I highly recommend to our audience to read this article, the first impression would be that it's actually a specialist. You are undergraduate student these days, back then, but still one can see that a specialist is dealing with this subject. And it's not just the narrative of a zombie. You're also dealing with a severe neurological disease, which you described it as a possible, I guess, a possible scenario in which such zombie creatures may appear. What could you tell us about this neurological disease, which could be very similar to that of a zombie disease?
So the article examines two sort of conditions. One is encephalitis lethargica, which is a disease that existed in about the 1920s here in Australia. It ran rampant for so many years, and then within the blink of an eye, it just vanished. It's now on the list of registered diseases, so if it was ever to re-emerge, it has to be reported on for the public's interest. And the second one that I look into is locked-in syndrome. So where somebody has suffered a sort of traumatized injury to the brain, which has caused them to enter into this coma-like state. And they're the two that I examined because of the neurological effects that run similarly to what we would consider zombieism or zombies. So in the sense that a person's personality, their entire being is completely taken away in both conditions, even though they are functioning very similarly and they're still running the same. It's just they're missing that personality, which is really devastating, but also very powerful because we're not stripping them entirely of what it is to be a human.
But why is this very rare disease, Encephalitis Lethargica, actually a proper example to discuss the consequences of such a scenario?
So encephalitis...
What does history teach us?
It's really interesting. Encephalitis, some of the early, very, very early findings represented that which we'd see in a pop fiction example of a zombie. So patients would sit up, they would try and bite the nurses, and it was typically nurses because they were lying asleep in their bed. They would sort of dribble and moan and have an absence of humanity in every possible way. So that's why when I was looking at the conditions, my mum's a nurse, so I was able to sort of pick her brain and say, look, what do you recommend? And she was the one who recommended it. And that's when I started really delving into it and finding out more about it.
Most probably you read the book written by Professor Oliver Sacks, Awakenings.
Yes.
It's actually a very thick book. But
yeah.
I started reading the book with the appendix since I saw the movie several years ago. In the appendix, Professor Sacks is describing an almost mysterious disease which actually arose out of the nowhere, and the way it appeared is very similar to the way it all of a sudden disappeared. But he had been dealing with this disease as a professor for neurology for like centuries. And one thing was very interesting. He said that apparently this disease might have appeared several times in the course of history. And every time medical practitioners and scientists seem to forget that a similar disease outbreak might have happened before, and that every time it appears under a different name. I mean, isn't that fabulous?
It's pretty incredible. And we're seeing that as well very heavily with COVID. So obviously that's our last pandemic that we've gone through since 2020. But you're spot on, and so is Oliver Sacks, that each and every one of these conditions has existed in some way, shape, or form beforehand. It's just taken on a whole new base. It's adapted. It's become malleable to society and the way that we function as a human, our DNA and our blood cells. It's all changed. It's actually managed to keep up. It's a bit like that saying, there's no such thing as an original idea. Diseases were the original idea. They adapt to us. And that's as well why we've seen it with COVID. We're seeing it with the bird flu that's going around. It continues to change.
There's a permanent change in nature. I mean, I couldn't agree more. But fun enough, several scientists report that some of the symptoms in COVID do resemble the symptoms of encephalitis lethargica. Respiratory problems, mental disorders, long COVID, particularly the brainstem infarct, things which, particularly the severe course of some cases, resembles, that's what they say, with this very rare disease. And surprisingly, the German Minister of Health, Professor Karl Lauterbach, is a doctor, is a medical doctor. Before he became Germany's Minister for Health, already 2020, he said that after COVID, one can still find it on Twitter. So he did not delete this posting. He said that after the pandemic, we will be facing maybe a new wave of encephalitis lethargica, the way the people were dealing with after the Spanish flu. I mean, there are some serious arguments that the Spanish flu and EL had no connection whatever, that they are not necessarily linked with each other. Maybe the influenza virus was a good story to calm down people, because it's a difference if you tell the people you're dealing with a severe neurological disease or you're dealing with something flu-like.
Yeah, it's very true. And to draw back to that point as well, some of the long-term effects of encephalitis include permanent changes to the brain. So dementia was brought on far quicker in people that had suffered and recovered from encephalitis, the same as we're seeing with COVID as well. Although with COVID, we can't quite measure the full effects because it's still such a new pandemic. But they're definitely, the way that I sort of see them, and I'm not a scientist, but the way that I've managed to put it together is they run like train tracks, encephalitis and COVID. There are so many similarities.
There's another similarity of this encephalitis lethargica with Ondine scores. That sounds very weird. And Ondine scores, it's actually a mystical disease, which again resembles COVID, particularly the respiratory problems once more here, do have many things in common with this. I'm not a scientist either, with encephalitis lethargica, but is there anything you could maybe tell us what it might have to deal with this Ondine scores? What does that mean, and what might be the origin of the name?
That's a good question. I'm not super familiar. I came across that term just recently, so I'm still trying to wrap my brain completely around it. But from what I understand, it starts off with some similar sort of symptoms, which again appear quite vague, a bit unsure. We're not quite sure how they match up, you know, cough, cold, sniffle sort of thing. But then again, it's the long-term testing that we're really concerned with. But yeah, I have to admit, I'm still wrapping my head around that one.
There is a distinction between actually the acquired and the congenital Ondine scores, but we're not medical doctors to go into details. But fun enough, this disease is based on a myth that Ondine, one of which is a nymph, one of Wotan's, the old Germanic god, which according to Carl Gustav Jung, does not resemble to any other god of any other religion, because he's a sort of charismatic, shaman-like, half god, half human being, and rather associated with a thunderstorm than with love. Wotan, one of Wotan's daughters, is this Ondine, and she fell in love with a human being, and because he betrayed her, she sent this spell on him, this curse, which made him unable to breathe. The hyperventilation of his lungs, he was unable to breathe, and then later he died. But in medicine, Ondine scores is an official name of a disease, which, again, scientists do compare with COVID. But one thing is very strange. You know, Wuhan is the city of Wuhan is one of the possible pronunciations for Wotan. So strange how German mythology and old myth might have and resemble with COVID. And to make a long story short, one is welcome to Google and see how very modern Wagner operas in Germany nowadays, they have Wotan's daughters being dressed up in zombies. So they play the modern zombies. So I do ask myself if there might be, that sounds strange what I'm saying, if there might be a whole zombie concept, a cultural one, in some mythologies which, flying below the radar, kept somehow alive.
Yeah, absolutely. I think zombieism has existed in culture for as long as humans have occupied a place on this earth. So my background, I'm a Maori woman, so my family are from New Zealand traditionally. And so customary speaking, everything is handed down through stories. And the way that we consider people who are deceased is never like they are truly deceased. They will always live on in us, which is reflective of perhaps a modern concept of zombieism in a way. And exactly as like you said, in mythology, the word zombie wasn't used. Maybe undead was used, or unalive, or something along those lines. It's honestly existed for as long as humans have occupied a space on this earth in some way, shape, or form.
Now, between the wars, what is your impression? How did states deal with EL? Do they adopt a special legal framework framework, how to deal with aggression. There are several reports about the young people having completely changed their personality, who all of a sudden became extremely aggressive.
This was
How
really
did societies react on that?
This was really interesting. I got very excited and very nerdy when I started to look into this. So when the first sort of cases of encephalitis lethargica came through, the laws didn't largely change. Policy was introduced similar to what we saw with COVID, that, don't go around hugging people. We don't know how this disease is spread. They are encouraged to wear the equivalent of masks, basically stay away from people, but the laws themselves didn't change. The court, however, when people started coming out of the disease, and exactly as you said, having those personality shifts, potentially the crime rates were horrendous amongst people who had otherwise had a clear record. The courts then had to adapt to that, recognizing that this was a personality trait or something that had developed as part of a disease. So their response had to go from punishing them to beginning to also rehabilitate and understand why this was occurring. That was one of the key changes in the criminal justice system. It was very slight, but if you read the judgments around that time, it's generally taken on board. It's really interesting.
So they
that was Australia's
admitted
large response.
a mental disorder. Is that correct?
In a way, yeah. It was never, so mental disorders, obviously in that time, it was non-existent. Nowhere did we have the understanding of what a mental health condition could partake with, but they did recognize to some degree that encephalitis lethargica altered someone's brain, and that caused them to behave irrationally, to go and commit crimes, to go and do all these things which we wouldn't see in them beforehand.
Have you ever considered, again, a question for two non-doctors, have you ever considered a potential scenario that maybe the true pandemic was actually EL and not the Spanish flu, and maybe that the Spanish flu was necessary in order to calm down the people and have the narrative of a plausible story? I interviewed a couple of weeks ago Professor Howard Phillips, who is an expert, a professor in the history of medicine at the University of Cape Town, South Africa. And he wrote his PhD thesis in the 80s in London about the Spanish flu in South Africa. And surprisingly, he interviewed doctors. When he started his research in the 70s, there were still doctors alive, and doctors told him that they were aware that they were not dealing with the flu. At the same time, the government was not willing, but that, he said, was not only valid for South Africa, for all, let's say, countries who fought against this pandemic, they were not willing to accept the possibility of a bioweapon, because that would have shown, first of all, a vulnerability of a society and of a political system, and would have easily shifted a hybrid war to a conventional war. So they prefer to say it's not a biological weapon, even though they had a strong evidence that the neurological lesions which occurred in the brainstem are most probably produced by a gas or by a toxic chemical.
It's interesting. I think when COVID was first announced, the world was flipped on its head. We truly had no idea how to respond to a pandemic. And that's why we saw things, particularly, I don't know how it was overseas, but in Australia, the hoarding started. Very similar to what we saw in the beginning of the World Wars. People started stockpiling things, particularly toilet paper, which was always mind-blowing. It's not a gastro disease. And it just made me laugh. It really did. But I digress. So I think society thrives on comparison. So by medicine saying that it stems from the Spanish flu, everybody can see a means to an end. We can see the natural path that the Spanish flu took And obviously putting it into the context that hygiene wasn't anywhere near as good, medicine wasn't anywhere near as good, vaccinations weren't anywhere near as good. But to introduce and say that it was like Encephalitis Lethargica, where it just dropped off the face of the earth, that would send people into turmoil. So I wonder if it was compared that way for comfort for society, but also because we don't know what path it's going to take, whether we'll turn around in 5 years' time and say, actually, it's more like encephalitis, or whether it still ruminates with the Spanish flu, or whether it was biological warfare. There's so much variance and so much unknown at the moment surrounding COVID.
The whole strategy, if I may tell you a typical Romanian joke, reminds me of an old Romanian joke from Transylvania. All of nowhere, all of a sudden, a giraffe appeared in a village. The people have never seen a giraffe in their whole life. So they gathered, the teacher came, the priest, and so further and so on. So they looked at it, and then the chief of the elderly council said, well, that's something which does not exist. So this strategy was also partly enforced during COVID pandemic, that apart, maybe a control group of people, of influential communicating vectors in a society, refused, denied the existence of the disease, as some refused and denied the existence of encephalitis lethargica and preferred talking about a flu. Both start with flu-like symptoms, by the way.
Better. Yeah. I refer to these people as ostriches because they like to put their head straight into the sand and pretend something doesn't exist. And I think when we look at it as well, that's a comfort for some people, that deniability, that concept that it doesn't exist. I'm going to go living on in my happy world. Not a good way to cope, in my opinion, because, you know, you're denying something that is existing around you, and that's possibly not the healthiest of mechanisms, not the happiest of coping, but it's better than hard drugs. So, you know, you do you. But absolutely, there are many denialists out there that still exist.
There's a very famous scientist, Australian scientist, Professor Paul Foley, and he's doing lots of research on the encephalitis lethargica, and he's speaking about a viral infection of the mind and of the brain. Apparently, this disease creates a very specific pattern, which is producing a partial mental decline, incapacitating people very selectively. So they are aware of a wrongdoing, but they cannot say why they are acting like that. That's the way I understood the psychiatric aspects of this zombie-like disease. Could such a pandemic be politically exploited by radical ideologies? Let's say, I ask myself, what if the Nazi party in the 30s was so successful because of an ideology on a proper breeding ground with incapacitated citizens who had no possibility whatever to make a proper distinction between a radical policy, a toxic propaganda, and a criminal agenda, and older, former, healthy, let's say, true values of societies. Could that have been a breeding ground for such radical ideologies, transforming society?
Yeah, I think so, absolutely. And I fear for what could become of that within the criminal law system. Because obviously part of criminal law is the ability to defend yourself. Certainly in Australia, we have the notion, or the law that you're innocent until proven guilty. So if, say, for example, encephalitis lethargica was to raise its head again, and suddenly we started seeing a very similar sort of route that we saw previously, where people's whole personality was changed, but they allegedly don't remember what happened, my biggest fear is how the legal system will be able to keep up with that, particularly as we've entered an age where something like a mental health condition has to be explored. It's going to be a severe drain on the legal system. It's going to be a severe drain if you're going through public defenders or legal aid or something like that. That's going to be a massive drain financially on them. And then in addition to that, it's creating a whole new movement. It's setting examples. It's only a matter of time before a precedent case is set for the better or for the worse. And that is my fear with it.
That radical ideologies will actually use maybe this phenomenon, the symptoms of long COVID once again, and create a severe impact on us, on societies. Is that what you think that might happen?
I think so. Perhaps maybe not radicalists, but certainly somebody who wants to exploit the system, which takes away from that transparency that Australian society really has with our court system.
So enforcing a change, whatever the change may be, a radical change.
Yes, I think so.
Because we spoke about Wotan and Wuhan, I recommend you, and also the audience, an essay written by the Swiss psychoanalyst and psychiatric Dr. Carl Gustav Jung. He wrote 1936 an essay called Wotan. And he says that he explains the rising to power of the Nazi party with Wotan's awakening. And he said, we must not look at people we must look at the people at people who are possessed of Wotan and are almost mentally unable to understand what they're dealing with. And he warned towards the end of this essay, I mean, it's Carl Gustav Jung, one of the most famous psychologists worldwide. Towards the end of the essay, he says that within a couple of years or centuries, we might be dealing with something which it's beyond our imagination, but giving a little thought to it, it will make us shivering. So I don't know, since he was a medical doctor, what he might have thought if this encephalitis lethargica was not politically exploited, almost in a mystical way in the Third Reich. No idea, but I think it's a very interesting question.
Yeah, it is really interesting. I think when it comes to diseases, when it comes to the alteration of a personality, when it comes to any of that, there is always a possibility that that could fall into the wrong hands and create the capacity for exploitation. And we unfortunately do live in a society with extremists. They do absolutely exist. There's no denying their ability. But I think, and my hope would be that the law is able to keep up with that. Maybe we're smart enough as a society to see through that extremist. Maybe we're not. Maybe we're brainwashed. Who knows? It's always hard to predict the future, and even more so when we are dealing with something like COVID, which is still so very unknown.
Tell me, have you had a look on the evolution of the legal framework dealing with dementia in society? Because I have the impression that a few years before Corona, before COVID, most of the countries in the world started creating a legal framework, like an infrastructure, like a highway infrastructure for dementia. And I've been asking myself, there are cases of dementia in society, but do we need such a legal infrastructure for these few cases? Nowadays, I'm asking myself, were they maybe at a certain extent aware that in future we might be having more patients and that we might need such a infrastructure for the increasing numbers of people suffering of dementia?
Absolutely. So one of the key cases, or one of the key sort of components we saw within the Australian law related to the exploitation of the elderly, particularly people who were suffering dementia. And this stemmed not from the person suffering, but the people around them who exploited it. So say, for example, you had an elderly woman in her 90s with dementia. asset rich, so she had quite a bit of money, and she had 2 children, one of which was the enduring power of attorney, had control over her finances and her day-to-day well-being. They were finding that they were ripping her off in every way, shape, or form because she didn't have the capacity to understand what was going on. So the law had to act very quickly in response to this. It wasn't just a one-off case, it was happening more and more. In addition to that, some of the retirement homes that we saw were doing the same thing. They were ripping people off who had no ability to speak up for themselves. That's where Australian law really started to develop. And that was probably about 10 years or so ago. And then as our understanding of dementia developed more and more, and our ability to diagnose much younger, and under certain conditions, and sort of linking it to things like COVID or encephalitis or something like that, the law had to respond again and tighten things up. So the law does respond, it just seems to take its time.
For instance, if you were to defend in court a person who is suffering of long COVID and who would say he is not willing to pay his taxes, he forgot all his invoices, and he is unaware of his duties. Could you plead not guilty because of a mental disorder?
Yeah, absolutely. It's a really interesting
waiting
question.
For the first case for a lawyer pleading for not guilty because of long COVID?
I'm waiting for it. I've got a couple of friends still within the criminal justice system, and I'm waiting for it. I think absolutely. Again, unfortunately, I've had COVID. I was one of the very lucky people, not once but twice last year. And I found sort of the period after about 6 or 8 weeks, my brain was foggy. It was like I was just so foggy, I had no idea what was going on. So I basically didn't leave my house for about 6 weeks following my sickness. And that's a personal experience that I'm sharing, just to sort of shed a light, on what my understanding of it is. Yeah. I mean, I think it's rare nowadays to find somebody who didn't have COVID.
Yeah, hardly find someone, yeah.
Yeah. So with some of the criminal justice system, if somebody committed a crime in the weeks following COVID, and they could prove through medical reports that it altered their understanding of what was going on, they weren't themselves, it was a temporary condition, blah, 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 you could absolutely plead not guilty for it. But the threshold, I think, would be very high. And that's one of the sort of key issues that we're facing in the legal system. Everybody has a right to sort of plead not guilty, but can medicine and medical reports keep up with that and support that notion? Because that is one of the only ways that it's going to be able to really get off the ground. That, and obviously their verbalization during the trial.
So do you think that the criminal justice and the system itself is playing on time in order to see how the disease maybe would develop, and see what new symptoms might appear because of the mental incapacity in future, in order to know how to deal with it, that they are somehow prudent and are in a rather defensive position because they might be aware of this potential of people claiming not guilty because of a severe disease?
I think absolutely. I truly think that it's a matter of time when a doctor or a specialist is able to have that strong supporting evidence that we start seeing that through the legal system. Yeah. And of course, our laws are going to have to respond accordingly. But I don't see how that could be any different to somebody who is going through, say, a paranoid schizophrenic episode at the time of the crime or something like that. So I think it will follow the same sort of linear pathway that was used to develop that legislation, as it would if we start to see this emerging within our criminal law system.
A last question, which I'd like to discuss with you, is you wrote in your article about human rights for zombies. And let's say, what about a society where, for instance, a majority, say 80%, would change in zombies? Who will have the custody on the zombies? What you thought, I'd like to know, you would say it would work up to 40% of the society? Would it be suitable up to 60%, but will not be working for 80% of the society?
I think it would depend on what sort of behavior we were exhibiting. I think if people were walking around chomping on each other's arms, then that would probably detract from a human right, because you'd be safe to sort of swing it that behavior is not something that you could see in in you or I, for example. So I think the threshold would have to be measured in behavior, if that makes sense. So if somebody with, say, encephalitis lethargica, exactly as I said before, is just sitting up and snapping at the nurse, that still creates that human-like aspect. They've still got brain activity. They're still behaving as if they're still behaving that way because they're unwell. But if they suddenly get up, start snapping at each other and ripping their throats out, then that is probably where the threshold starts to get to the, we can't handle this. This is not a human anymore.
But if someone is really lethargic, actually a very small minority is lethargic. I think it was McNulty, a famous British scientist in the 30s, he said, the name is so confusing because not the encephalitis is lethargic. Some of the patients, it's rather an epidemic encephalitis.
Yes. Yeah, that's right. Yeah, the term in encephalitis lethargica is actually misleading, because unlike, say, for example, long COVID, where you're exceptionally tired, you're lethargic, encephalitis doesn't have that. The term lethargica, from my understanding, was used to describe the symptoms of the time. That is, they spent a lot of their time sleeping, but with very limited brain activity. And so that's why they coined that term and they added it on to the end. But we now know that that isn't necessarily what happened. You know, some people were sitting up and just unable to talk and do those things. They weren't sleeping. So it was a bit of a misleading term, really, when you look back on the cases and how some of the patients presented.
Do you think that that was on purpose to have misleading terms?
I wouldn't say it was on purpose. I think it goes back to a comfort. Again, people are going to be more comfortable with a term they're familiar with. So if we just presented the term encephalitis to, you know, everybody in society, that's probably going to strike panic in them. But if we say encephalitis lethargica, people are going to say lethargic, lethargy. If they're tired, okay, that makes me feel a bit better. You know, it starts to give a more humane understanding to it, to people who aren't scientists.
So none of the people hearing lethargica would give a thought on that or say, oh, it's not affecting me, it must be the others. I'm fine. I'm not feeling sleepy at all.
Yeah, I think so. I think that's exactly it. But, you know, even when I first looked into it, I thought, oh, this sounds terrifying. And then, you know, I even said to myself, oh, it's lethargica. It's fine. You know, it's not a big deal.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for having watched this excellent discussion with Erina Flethcher live from Canberra. Erina, thank you very, very much for joining me. What time is it now in Canberra, if I may ask? It's 10 o'clock over here in Switzerland.
It's 7:52 p.m, so dinner time, basically.
So I still wish you a wonderful evening, nice late summer evening there in Australia.
Yes.
And thanks once more for this interesting discussion.
And thanks so much for having me. I really appreciated it.
Wishing you lots of success in future, and furthermore, very intriguing and almost visionary articles like the one you published, which determined me to invite you in Compass. All the best.
Honored. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.